Welcome to A Sound Constitution with Mahir, Sharon, Katie, and Brandy on 101.7 CHLY Radio.
We are third-year nursing students at Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo.
We're here working to demystify health issues in and around your community.
Bringing you evidence-based information about your healthcare options. This information is for educational purposes and does not replace the advice of your primary healthcare provider.
We would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Sinimu First Nation.
Hello and welcome to another airing of A Sound Constitution on 101.7 CHLY. I'm Mahir, and today we'll be discussing self-compassion, self-care, and stress. As exam season, tax season, allergy season, rain season, and any other season that stresses you out approaches, we hope today's show will give you some guidance on how to minimize the stress. We will talk about stress, how to deal with it, and self-compassion. We have an interview with VIU faculty Shannon Dames, as well as a TED Talk on the need for emotional self-aid. So now I want to touch on self-care. The following information was taken from crisiscenter.bc.ca. To understand self-care, it's helpful to understand stress. Stress is just a reaction to a situation, event, or person, real or imagined. Regardless of whether the stressor is real or imagined, the response is the same and always real. Stress presents itself in many ways, including changes in your body, such as headaches, stomach aches, disturbed sleep, or changes in appetite. Stress is also apparent in your actions, such as increased use of alcohol and drugs, withdrawing from people, increased smoking, too little or non-stop talking, being short-tempered or fidgeting, changes in your emotions, such as changes in thinking, loneliness, depression, worries, feeling sad, hopeless or suicidal, trouble concentrating, loss of self-control, or lapses in memory and poor judgment are all possible. So now that we know we're stressed, we can work on how to not feel stressed. In its simplest terms, and as defined by Merriam-Webster, self-care is caring for the self. Sounds pretty easy, right? So here are some examples of self-care and what you can do to feel less stress. Step away from what is stressing you out. Even if it's just for a few minutes, take a break. Do something to take your mind off of the stressor. Whatever other action that is, that's self-care. Be it a walk, playing with the kids or pets, reading a few pages of a book, a nap, doing the dishes, or cooking. All of those are examples of self-care. Crisis Center BC also has other examples. Positive self-talk can be used to decrease one's stress. The first thing they recommend is positive self-talk. To decrease stress, it's important to change the way that we talk to ourselves. And this will lead to you changing the way that you think about yourself. This is accomplished from shifting negative self-talk to positive self-talk. Some examples include the negative, I can't help how I feel, I'm feeling miserable. To the positive, I can control my feelings and do things to change how I feel. Negative, I need to worry about everything that could go wrong. Positive, I can learn to concentrate on the present moment and focus on the things that need to be addressed first. Other long-term stress methods include getting enough sleep, exercising, eating better, laughing more, using positive self-talk, and managing your time better, as well as taking an effort to relax. That includes getting enough sleep, drinking enough water, eating enough food, and doing other things to help calm yourself down when you feel stressed out. Taking care of yourself can help you decrease the stress that you feel. Better stress management and self-care can enable you to deal better with problems, increase your productivity, decrease your stress, and have stronger relationships. Having increased energy as well as better overall health and increase your self-esteem. Now, here's Dawn of Ages by Unleash the Archers from their album Demons of the Astral Waste. That was Dawn of Ages by Unleash the Archers from their album Demons of the Astral Waste. Now, our field team sits down with Shannon Dames, Vancouver Island University nursing faculty who is currently working on her PhD and has a special interest in self-compassion.
Here with Shannon James. And so, Shannon, do you first want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I teach at the university in the nursing program. I have a couple small kids at home and a life partner who's amazing. And I've been a nurse for about 16 years. And I'm also finishing a doctorate in education, specifically on the topic of surviving and thriving and what makes nurses do one more than the other.
Great. So we'll jump right in then. So what does self-compassion mean?
So I've thought about this question since you showed it to me, and you'd think it would be something I could do right off the cuff because I've studied this stuff, but it's really the ability to extend your kindness to yourself when you feel like you've made a mistake or there's a shortcoming or just some kind of perceived inadequacy. So it's basically your self-response and whether that's kind or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are the benefits of having self-compassion?
Self-compassion is probably one of the most watered down concepts, and yet one of the most important concepts in psychology. It is what enables us to take situations that can be quite stressful and full of shame and turn them into learning moments where we can kind of pivot, pick ourselves back up, and move forward in a more optimistic fashion. So the benefits are really decreases anxiety, depression, a whole host of mental and physical ailments really over time. And it also enables us to thrive in a lot of environments that other people might really struggle.
Okay. You mentioned you've been studying nursing and thriving and surviving. So how is self-compassion important to people working in healthcare specifically?
Well, healthcare, because of its nature, and we talk a lot about best practice, so it tends to be an area where there's a lot of black and white thinking or binary thinking, which then leads itself to kind of perfectionism, which is not all bad. However, perfectionism, specifically maladaptive perfectionism, is on the other extreme to self-compassion. So self-compassion really enables us to have a balance when we're working in cultures that are quite black and white. Because what can happen in those black and white cultures is we get a lot of negative self-talk, because if you're not compassionate, you often give yourself you can ruminate a lot on self-destructive thoughts. And not only that, you tend to be more critical on other people. So you treat other people the same way you treat yourself. So in healthcare environments that are often quite critical, quite black and white, people don't feel emotionally safe. Those that are self-compassionate tend to be buffered from a lot of that. So they're able to survive a lot of those, and not just survive, but thrive, where other people kind of wither, that are really dependent on how other people think of them, as stressors in the field and that kind of thing. Do I have a little more time to give a little analogy?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I like to think of it like a tree. And if we were in a forest and we were all a bunch of trees, some of those trees that have the deeper roots would be people that have a lot higher levels of self-compassion. So what that means is basically if we have an inner sanctuary that's quite safe, where we can go when we're stressed or when we're feeling down or when we've made a mistake, and we go there and we find a compassionate or kind voice, then it allows us to build really deep roots, and it makes us less prone to the weather. So those trees that have more shallow roots or who are more low in self-compassion are going to be a lot more prone to weather. So they're going to go into survival mode much, much quicker because the winds and whatnot can blow them over. Whereas those with deep roots are more self-sustaining. So if I were to put that in like a one sentence description, I would say self-compassion really enables us to self-sustain even when the weather or the conditions, the environment is quite stressful.
Great. Okay, so do you think people tend to neglect self-compassion, and if so, why?
Yeah, I don't come from this as a person, a beacon of self-compassion in any way, shape, or form. I've had to learn self-compassion. I'm still learning self-compassion. Mm-hmm. People generally neglect self-compassion because they haven't learned it in childhood. Mm-hmm. So if we have compassion given to us by an authority figure or authority figures, unconditional positive self-regard is what Carl Rogers, a seminal psychologist, would say, then that is, we then mirror that same compassion to self. So if we get that in our developmental years, it becomes natural. We naturally do it in our adulthood. Many of us don't get it. And if you didn't get it in your childhood, you will not naturally get it in your adulthood. You have to actually consciously build it. Mm-hmm. So what happens is those that didn't get it in their childhood tend to be a lot more at risk for maladaptive perfectionism, which really goes into a whole bunch of reasons why we get into addictions and all that, because we need reprieve from ourselves, mm-hmm. right? Like that safe space that others might go into to find their sanctuary. For those that are low in self-compassion, is there's kind of a cast of characters there that criticize, mm-hmm. right? So we have to go outside ourselves with chemicals and whatnot, substance abuse, to get reprieve from those critical voices. So we have to learn it. And if we don't learn it as kids, and many of us don't, we have to consciously learn it as adults.
Great. So how does our current culture here in North America affect self-compassion?
So North America is an individualist society for the most part, meaning in capitalism, tends to increase our desire to be competitive, to earn our value based on achievement. We tie our value to the opinions of others and getting ahead of others. So what that does is it creates a lot of social dominance. And social dominance is and feeds into perfectionism, which feeds into emotional dissociation, and ultimately that takes us away from that safe sanctuary that I was talking about earlier, because it becomes about achievements. And if we don't achieve, or we make a mistake, or there's shortcomings, that then threatens our very sense of self. Probably the easiest way to illustrate that is through Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a little bit simplistic, but it kind of gets the picture across that if we don't have our basic esteem, belonging, physiological, and safety needs met, then we're going to feel threatened, and we're going to feel like we need to compensate by showing other people we're valuable. And in an individualist society, it puts achievement and competition over the ability to care for self.
Mm-hmm. And it reminds me of what you said earlier about the black and white. Like when you're achieving, you either succeed or you fail at that. And so that leads into then the, I guess, opportunity to be compassionate to yourself or not. So
yeah, and you know, if we're in a society that we feel defined by our image and our achievements, then it becomes, if we do feel like we fail or we make a mistake, our very core being becomes threatened. Mm-hmm. Whereas if we have that inner sanctuary where we accept ourselves, which requires self-compassion to accept yourself fully, then those mistakes that we make, they aren't so threatening because we have a loving sense of self that we rely on more than the achievement that we may or may not reach.
Okay, so I feel like the next question kind of ties into what we're talking about a bit, but like this sense of failure, why do you think people are so often afraid of failing at something?
It is a good question though, because it's those that have, like, self-compassion is highly tied to the ability to pivot. So meaning if we make a mistake, because it doesn't threaten our sense of self and send us into this negative thought rumination, we actually can be more objective and we can orient ourselves in a situation where we can look at what happened and make some changes, some adaptions, and then try something else. If we're stuck in a state of low self-compassion, we tend to then go to that negative place, and it actually shuts down our ability to pivot because we can't even think creatively or think about the situation and how we might improve because we are spending all our time beating ourselves up about it.
So would you say people who have more self-compassion would be less afraid of failing at something?
Totally, right, because they have those deep roots. They're self-sustaining, right? So the weather, our achievements are really weather, whether it's storms or winds or whatever. All of those things don't define us. They affect us, but they don't define us. Far less threatening.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to A Sound Constitution on 101.7 CHLY. Today, we're discussing self-compassion and stress, and currently, we're interviewing Shannon Dames, a VIU faculty.
So, speaking of stress now, what are some ill effects of being in that stressful environment?
Well, I think if we look at our society now, with all the depression and anxiety that a lot of us feel on a fairly regular basis, really prone to the weather. And what those long-term causes have a number of physical and not just mental health anymore, but physical ailments as well. And then when we talk about addictive substances, and if we're all honest about addictions come in many forms, some more socially acceptable than others. But those addictions really, like I said, they're like reprieve from ourselves, right? So that stress, when we have self-compassion, the stress comes from the negative self-talk. What we're telling ourselves, the story that we're believing, that we are creating, the tape that we are playing. So if we're self-compassionate and loving, and that sanctuary inside is one that's kind and nurturing, that dissipates a lot of that stress and a lot of that need to go to those other things that are responsible for a lot of health issues as well. So,
because like you mentioned earlier, it's like your very identity is being threatened, and that's very stressful in itself to...
Totally, and it causes emotional dissociation, right? Because it is so scary that we dissociate. And within dissociation is where all the things pop out, right? All the anxiety, the depression, the grasping and the pushing away, the addictions. So if we can stay connected to our emotions, which is really through accessing a safe sanctuary inside, then a lot of those other things kind of dissipate.
Okay, great. So what influences people's abilities to deal with stress? I feel like we did touch on this a little bit, but is there anything we missed?
Yeah, I'm always a little careful on these types of questions because I'm beginning to believe that even things like exercise and diet and all that, they're important. But I think sometimes even they can distract us from actually just going in and finding our own safe space. So, because even, obsessing, it can be an addiction too, about exercise and food and all that kind of stuff, right? So, and sometimes it just distracts us from what we really need to do, which is deal with some of the shame that we might have, or the cast of characters that's not being kind to ourselves. So I could answer that, and I could give people some great tools to go out and do, but I think actually that's a distraction, because really we need to sit with self. We need to dig through our shadows and deal with some of the stuff we're so afraid of.
Really address what's really the issue.
Exactly, which keeps us from going into a sanctuary because it's not safe. So we got to make it safe.
Okay. So we are speaking of resources now. So do you have any resources that will help people find like self-compassion and deal with stress? Or
Yeah. So again, I think shame is really the root emotion to, I think, all things that tend to go sideways. So I tend to go back to that. And shame really is dissipated through exposure to light. So that's having a safe space to talk to somebody. It doesn't have to be a counselor, right? Sometimes counselors are great because we don't feel guilty necessarily about putting our stuff on them. Sometimes friends and family, that's harder. It's really about having compassion mirrored to you. So if you didn't have an unconditional, a relationship of unconditional positive regard as a child, you need to find those as an adult so we can mirror that, immerse ourselves in that, and learn compassion. And then, I think some of what's in the research, and there's some research about building self-compassion as adults, is mindfulness, because we have to know when we're going into those spirals, those negative thought spirals, so that we can even consciously address it. So mindfulness is huge. Or meditation, loving kindness practice is really big. So if you're mindful of when you're starting to spiral and go into that self-condemnation type mode, then we can address it by sitting and doing kind of loving kindness exercises. And there's a ton of them on the internet. People can Google it, and there's lots of options. I have found that has worked very well for me, is if you develop the habit of mind to recognize when you're not being kind and when that sanctuary doesn't feel safe, and you're willing to sit with it and let things rise up so they can be dealt with, find a safe space where you can talk it out. And over time, that habit develops and becomes more natural. And over time, that sanctuary starts to feel safe. And you might even find you actually want to go there rather than doing everything possible to distract ourselves from going to that sense of self. Yeah.
So if we see someone else struggling with a lot of stress, and maybe you can see them struggling to be compassionate to themselves, like what are some ways you can help other people who are struggling with this?
My husband and I are we play off each other quite a bit in this realm. So I think it's important to have somebody that you can talk to about with it, right? And especially in some of our careers and cultures, can be quite shaming. We shame ourselves, we shame each other. So the only way to handle social dominance and self-dominance or self-destructive thoughts is to come at it with light and compassion. So shaming a shamer, it does no good, right? Bullying the bully does no good. Half the time we are the bully. We bully ourselves. So to address all forms of bullying, including self-bullying, it's really about giving compassion, like being that person that can give unconditional positive regard. So it's that somebody that can look at you, or you can look at and say, I see you. I see your shortcomings. I see that you are not perfect, and I accept you. And if we feel that safe with them, and we can give that to other people, then we start to realize that we can also accept ourselves. Because somebody else is showing us that it's possible. So it's really mirroring it to one another.
Okay. And I just wanted to talk something else. We talked a little bit about mental health earlier, I think, and we did an episode on it last week. And I was just thinking, and it sounded like you were saying that you believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but self-compassion is linked to a lot of the mental health that we are seeing nowadays, like the depression, anxiety, like the self-compassion could be a big part of that, or lack of.
Yeah, so I will say, so cortisol is a real thing. So it is, the stress hormone. There are ways to deal with our cortisol. So like doing 10 minutes cardio is a great way to shake off some cortisol, and doing, 4-7-8 breathing, where we're like, breathing exercises that help us kind of release some of that energy. Very important, so that we create a space where we can even think about self-compassion. So let me just say that first. And then secondly, self-compassionate people in the literature do not have all of these mental health issues. It is not linked to people with high levels of self-compassion. And that being said, there are biological components that are obviously not, outside of that, the exception to that rule. However, a lot of our mental health issues these days are very much related to frames of mind, and self-compassion addresses frames of mind. Yeah.
Okay, great. And I just wanted to ask, is there anything that you think is really important about this that I didn't ask in the questions? I want to be very careful, because I can already see people's hair going up about self-compassion solving all mental health issues. So I will just underscore that fact, that there are lots of mental health issues that are not addressed with self-compassion. Yeah. However, there are a lot that would be addressed if we could all learn to be a little more self-compassionate, because it addresses the initial release of cortisol, and then B, the sitting in that high level of chronic cortisol for much longer than we need to. Thank you so much, Shannon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shannon and Katie, for that great interview. Before we move on, I'd like to expand a little on a couple of the terms that were discussed. First off, I'd like to touch on what is meant by unconditional positive regard. As Shannon mentioned, this term was coined by humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers, and basically what unconditional positive regard means is that a person is accepted by others for who they are, regardless of their flaws or shortcomings. So this positive regard can be coming from anyone. It could be parents, siblings, friends, therapists. Really anyone can show unconditional positive regard. Unconditional positive self-regard, on the other hand, means that we show this acceptance for ourselves to ourselves. This means that we accept ourselves for who we are, we forgive ourselves for our mistakes and failures, and we show ourselves self-compassion. One time, I was speaking with Shannon after going through a particularly stressful series of events in my life, and Shannon said to me, "Brandy, if I had just told you that story, how much compassion would you have for me?" And you know what? That really made me stop and think. If someone else told me about the hardships they were facing, I would easily have compassion for their situation. So why was it so difficult to show myself the same compassion? Since that conversation, I have found myself stopping to think about how I would feel if someone else was telling the story, and it really helps to put things into perspective to find a little self-compassion and positive regard. The next thing I'd like to touch on is the term maladaptive perfectionism. What does that mean? Well, first let's look at perfectionism. Perfectionism is basically the desire to achieve perfection. Many studies have looked at perfectionism in two lights. There's adaptive and maladaptive. Adaptive perfectionism is described as being a normal and healthy way of being, where one feels a sense of satisfaction for achievements that took a lot of effort. But if success isn't perfect or it doesn't happen at all, that's okay too. Failure is something we can learn from, and adaptive perfectionism often leads to some great psychological benefits, such as self-esteem, life satisfaction, motivation, positive coping, and a sense of social support. Maladaptive perfectionism, on the other hand, is not so positive. A study by Rice and Stewart in 2010 defines maladaptive perfectionism as when a person has high personal performance standards and is also very critical of themselves. So with maladaptive perfectionism, when things don't go according to plan, rather than growing from the experience as an adaptive perfectionist would, the maladaptive perfectionist will develop negative attitudes towards themselves and their surroundings, which can lead to negative psychological impacts such as depression, anxiety, stress, emotional, and even physical pains. So really what it comes down to is that it's okay to want to succeed in our tasks, but when we don't get 100% results, we need to try and take it as an opportunity to learn and grow rather than beat ourselves up about it.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to A Sound Constitution on 101.7 CHLY. Now we're going to play a song called Where Did You Go by the Victoria band Jets Overhead from their album Bridges. What's really interesting is that the band Jets Overhead's music has been featured on some big-name TV shows such as House, Pretty Little Liars, and Bones. They've also toured internationally in Europe and China and collaborated with some big-name artists. This specific song was played on the TV show House.
Stop to think and look within. Ordinary sins. Think you must have heard her wrong, 'cause she wasn't gone that long. Where did you go? Ooh, I don't wanna know. Where did you go? Ooh, I don't wanna know. Where did you go? Ooh, I don't wanna know. Looking lost into the night. She's gonna lose this fight. He'll just say the job ran late. The solitary fate. Stop to drink, come wrinkle chin. Ordinary sins. Think you must have heard him wrong, 'cause he wasn't gone that long. Where did you go? Ooh, I don't wanna know. Where did you go? Ooh, I don't wanna know. Where did you go? Ooh, I don't wanna know. Ooh, somebody. Who's someone? Who's somebody? Who's someone? Who's somebody? Who's somebody?
That was Where Did You Go by the Victoria band Jets Overhead from their album Bridges. Now we have a TED Talk by a psychologist about the need for emotional first aid.
TED Talks are recorded live at the TED Conference and partner events. This episode features psychologist Guy Winch. This talk contains powerful visuals. Download the video at TED.com. Here's Guy Winch.
I grew up with my identical twin, who was an incredibly loving brother. Now, one thing about being a twin is it makes you an expert at spotting favoritism. If his cookie was even slightly bigger than my cookie, I had questions. And clearly, I wasn't starving. When I became a psychologist, I began to notice favoritism of a different kind. And that is how much more we value the body than we do the mind. I spent 9 years at university earning my doctorate in psychology, and I can't tell you how many people look at my business card and say, "Oh, a psychologist, so not a real doctor." As if it should say that on my card. This favoritism we show the body over the mind. I see it everywhere. I recently was at a friend's house and their 5-year-old was getting ready for bed. He was standing on a stool by the sink brushing his teeth when he slipped and scratched his leg on the stool when he fell. He cried for a minute, but then he got back up, got back on the stool and reached out for a box of Band-Aids to put one on his cut. Now, this kid could barely tie his shoelaces, but he knew you have to cover a cut so it doesn't become infected, and you have to care for your teeth by brushing twice a day. We all know how to maintain our physical health and how to practice dental hygiene, right? We know it since we were 5 years old. But what do we know about maintaining our psychological health? Well, nothing. What do we teach our children about emotional hygiene? Nothing. How is it we spend more time taking care of our teeth than we do our minds? Why is it our physical health is so much more important to us than our psychological health? You know, we sustain psychological injuries even more often than we do physical ones, injuries like failure or rejection or loneliness. And they can also get worse if we ignore them, and they can impact our lives in dramatic ways. And yet, even though there are scientifically proven techniques we could use to treat these kinds of psychological injuries, we don't. It doesn't even occur to us that we should. Oh, you're feeling depressed. Just shake it off. It's all in your head. Can you imagine saying that to somebody with a broken leg? Oh, just walk it off. It's all in your leg. It is time we close the gap between our physical and our psychological health. It's time we made them more equal, more like twins. Speaking of which, my brother is also a psychologist, so he's not a real doctor either. We didn't study together, though. In fact, the hardest thing I've ever done in my life is move across the Atlantic to New York City to get my doctorate in psychology. We were apart then for the first time in our lives, and the separation was brutal for both of us. But while he remained among family and friends, I was alone in a new country. We missed each other terribly, but international phone calls were really expensive then, and we could only afford to speak for 5 minutes a week. When our birthday rolled around, it was the first we wouldn't be spending together. We decided to splurge, and that week we would talk for 10 minutes. I spent the morning pacing around my room, waiting for him to call, and waiting, and waiting. But the phone didn't ring. Given the time difference, I assumed, okay, he's out with friends, he'll call later. There were no cell phones then. But he didn't. And I began to realize that after being away for over 10 months, he no longer missed me the way I missed him. I knew he would call in the morning, but that night was one of the saddest and longest nights of my life. I woke up the next morning. I glanced down at the phone, and I realized I had kicked it off the hook when pacing the day before. I stumbled out of bed, I put the phone back on the receiver, and it rang a second later. And it was my brother. And boy, was he pissed. It was the saddest and longest night of his life as well. Now, I tried to explain what happened, but he said, I don't understand. If you saw I wasn't calling you, why didn't you just pick up the phone and call me? He was right. Why didn't I call him? I didn't have an answer then. But I do today, and it's a simple one. Loneliness. Loneliness creates a deep psychological wound, one that distorts our perceptions and scrambles our thinking. It makes us believe that those around us care much less than they actually do. It makes us really afraid to reach out, because why set yourself up for rejection and heartache when your heart is already aching more than you can stand? I was in the grips of real loneliness back then, but I was surrounded by people all day, so it never occurred to me. But loneliness is defined purely subjectively. It depends solely on whether you feel emotionally or socially disconnected from those around you, and I did. There is a lot of research on loneliness, and all of it is horrifying. Loneliness won't just make you miserable, it will kill you. I'm not kidding. chronic loneliness increases your likelihood of an early death by 14%. 14%. Loneliness causes high blood pressure, high cholesterol. It even suppresses the functioning of your immune system, making you vulnerable to all kinds of illnesses and diseases. In fact, scientists have concluded that taken together, chronic loneliness poses as significant a risk for your long-term health and longevity as cigarette smoking. Now, cigarette packs come with warnings saying this could kill you, but loneliness doesn't. And that's why it's so important we prioritize our psychological health, that we practice emotional hygiene. Because you can't treat a psychological wound if you don't even know you're injured. Loneliness isn't the only psychological wound that distorts our perceptions and misleads us. Failure does that as well. I once visited a daycare center where I saw 3 toddlers play with identical plastic toys. You had to slide the red button and a cute doggy would pop out. One little girl tried pulling the purple button, then pushing it, and then she just sat back and looked at the box with her lower lip trembling. The little boy next to her watched this happen, then turned to his box and burst into tears without even touching it. Meanwhile, another little girl tried everything she could think of until she slid the red button, the cute doggy popped out, and she squealed with delight. So, 3 toddlers with identical plastic toys, but with very different reactions to failure. The first 2 toddlers were perfectly capable of sliding a red button. The only thing that prevented them from succeeding was their mind tricked them into believing they could not. Now, adults get tricked this way as well all the time. In fact, we all have a default set of feelings and beliefs that gets triggered whenever we encounter frustrations and setbacks. Are you aware of how your mind reacts to failure? You need to be. Because if your mind tries to convince you you're incapable of something and you believe it, then like those 2 toddlers, you'll begin to feel helpless and you'll stop trying too soon, or you won't even try at all. And then you'll be even more convinced you can't succeed. You see, that's why so many people function below their actual potential. Because somewhere along the way, sometimes a single failure convinced them that they couldn't succeed, and they believed it. Once we become convinced of something, it's very difficult to change our mind. I learned that lesson the hard way when I was a teenager with my brother. We were driving with friends down a dark road at night when a police car stopped us. There had been a robbery in the area and they were looking for suspects. The officer approached the car and he shined his flashlight on the driver, then on my brother in the front seat, and then on me, and his eyes opened wide and he said, "Where have I seen your face before?" And I said, "In the front seat." But that made no sense to him whatsoever, so now he thought I was on drugs. So he drags me out of the car, he searches me, he marches me over to the police car, and only when he verified I don't have a police record could I show him I had a twin in the front seat. But even as we were driving away, you could see by the look on his face, he was convinced that I was getting away with something. Our mind is hard to change once we become convinced. So it might be very natural to feel demoralized and defeated after you fail, but you cannot allow yourself to become convinced you can't succeed. You have to fight feelings of helplessness. You have to gain control over the situation. And you have to break this kind of negative cycle before it begins.
If you're just tuning in, you're listening to a Sound Constitution on 101.7 CHLY. Today, we're discussing self-care, stress, and self-compassion. Currently, we're listening to a TED Talk by a psychologist on the need for emotional self-aid.
Our minds and our feelings, they're not the trustworthy friends we thought they were. They're more like a really moody friend who can be totally supportive one minute and really unpleasant the next. I once worked with this woman who, after 20 years of marriage, and an extremely ugly divorce, was finally ready for her first date. She had met this guy online, and he seemed nice, and he seemed successful, and most importantly, he seemed really into her. So she was very excited. She bought a new dress, and they met at an upscale New York City bar for a drink. 10 minutes into the date, the man stands up and says, "I'm not interested," and walks out. Rejection is extremely painful. The woman was so hurt she couldn't move. All she could do was call a friend. And here's what the friend said. "Well, what do you expect? You have big hips, you have nothing interesting to say. Why would a handsome, successful man like that ever go out with a loser like you?" Shocking, right, that a friend can be so cruel. But it would be much less shocking if I told you it wasn't the friend who said that. It's what the woman said to herself. And that's something we all do, especially after a rejection. We all start thinking of all our faults and all our shortcomings, what we wish we were, what we wish we weren't. We call ourselves names, maybe not as harshly, but we all do it. And it's interesting that we do, because our self-esteem is already hurting. Why would we want to go and damage it even further? Right? We wouldn't make a physical injury worse on purpose. You wouldn't get a cut on your arm and decide, "Oh, I know, I'm going to take a knife and see how much deeper I can make it." But we do that with psychological injuries all the time. Why? Because of poor emotional hygiene. Because we don't prioritize our psychological health. We know from dozens of studies that when your self-esteem is lower, you are more vulnerable to stress and to anxiety, that failures and rejections hurt more, and it takes longer to recover from them. So when you get rejected, the first thing you should be doing is to revive your self-esteem, not join Fight Club and beat it into a pulp. When you're in emotional pain, treat yourself with the same compassion you would expect from a truly good friend. We have to catch our unhealthy psychological habits and change them. And one of the unhealthiest and most common is called rumination. To ruminate means to chew over. It's when your boss yells at you, or your professor makes you feel stupid in class, or you have a big fight with a friend, and you just can't stop replaying the scene in your head for days, sometimes for weeks on end. Now, ruminating about upsetting events in this way can easily become a habit, and it's a very costly one. Because by spending so much time focused on upsetting and negative thoughts, you are actually putting yourself at significant risk for developing clinical depression, alcoholism, eating disorders, and even cardiovascular disease. The problem is, the urge to ruminate can feel really strong and really important, so it's a difficult habit to stop. I know this for a fact, because a little over a year ago, I developed the habit myself. You see, my twin brother was diagnosed with stage 3 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. His cancer was extremely aggressive. He had visible tumors all over his body. And he had to start a harsh course of chemotherapy. And I couldn't stop thinking about what he was going through. I couldn't stop thinking about how much he was suffering. Even though he never complained, not once. He had this incredibly positive attitude. His psychological health was amazing. I was physically healthy, but psychologically I was a mess. But I knew what to do. Studies tell us that even a 2-minute distraction is sufficient to break the urge to ruminate in that moment. And so each time I had a worrying, upsetting, negative thought, I forced myself to concentrate on something else until the urge passed. And within 1 week, my whole outlook changed and became more positive and more hopeful. 9 weeks after he started chemotherapy, my brother had a CAT scan, and I was by his side when he got the results. All the tumors were gone. He still had 3 more rounds of chemotherapy to go, but we knew he would recover. This picture was taken 2 weeks ago. By taking action when you're lonely, by changing your responses to failure, by protecting your self-esteem, by battling negative thinking, you won't just heal your psychological wounds, you will build emotional resilience. You will thrive. 100 years ago, people began practicing personal hygiene, and life expectancy rates rose by over 50% in just a matter of decades. I believe our quality of life could rise just as dramatically if we all began practicing emotional hygiene. Can you imagine what the world would be like if everyone were psychologically healthier? If there were less loneliness and less depression? If people knew how to overcome failure? If they felt better about themselves and more empowered? If they were happier and more fulfilled? I can, because that's the world I want to live in. And that's the world my brother wants to live in as well. And if you just become informed and change a few simple habits, well, that's the world we can all live in. Thank you very much.
That was a TED Talk by psychologist Guy Winch about emotional hygiene. As we heard in that talk, as well as from our guest speaker Shannon Dames, taking care of our emotional selves is very important to our overall well-being, and having a little self-compassion can go a long way. We hope you enjoyed today's show, and as always, check out our Facebook page for resources from today's show, and if there's something you'd like to hear us talk about, let us know through email at asoundconstitution@gmail.com or on our Facebook page, A Sound Constitution.
Thanks for listening to Sound Constitution on 101.7 CHLY.
Look for us on Facebook and Instagram.
Or check us out on YouTube for previous shows.
Tune in next Thursday from 10 to 11 for more from A Sound Constitution.
Bye for now.